Wait as well.
I just started the recording now so that I don't forget to do it.
Okay, well, watch what you say, because Mark Sand is in the building now. Welcome, Mark.
Thank you. There we go. See you, folks.
I have noon, but I think we're going to wait just a couple more minutes for people to join. We'll start in just about 2 after. Okay, I think I'm going to go ahead and get started. I assume we'll have more people joining us as we go along, but in the interest of time, we have a lot of ground to cover, so I'd like to get started. Today's panel is the second event in the Threat to American Democracy series, which is co-sponsored by the Community Engagement Office here at CSM and the Diversity and Inclusion Office. Today's panel is titled All In, the Fight for Democracy and Voter Suppression, and looks particularly at voter suppression efforts and attempts to combat them in Nebraska. And we are honored to have 3 civic leaders who are working on those efforts here to discuss that with us today. We will have time at the end of the panel discussion for questions. So if you have a burning question that you want to, that occurs to you that you want to make sure it is addressed, please feel free to put that in the chat and we'll address it at the end. And I think that's, oh, I am recording. And we will share this recording with each of the panelists today. And they may choose to share it via social media. So with all that said, I think we'll go ahead and get started with the panelists. And what I'd like to ask each of you to do is to take a minute to introduce yourselves, talk about the organizations that you work with, and a little bit about how you came to your interest or what your interest is in voting rights and voter suppression. And Mr. Alexander, if we want to start with you.
Yeah, my name is Bear Alexander. I'm an organizer with the Revolutionary Action Party. The Revolutionary Action Party is a group of Black and Brown activists, and our main objective is to liberate ourselves and our communities from the chains that we have been subjugated to by any means necessary. And I also am a part of Power of People Omaha, which is a political action committee, and we are leading the $15 minimum wage ballot initiative in Douglas County, while also partnering with Nebraska Appleseed and the coalition with that as well.
Great. Ms. Glissman.
Yeah, hello. Thank you for having me. I'm honored to be here with Mr. Love and Mr. Alexander. And joining you today, I'm a co-president of the League of Women Voters Greater Nebraska. The League is a nonpartisan political organization. It's a 501c3 nonprofit. It does not endorse or support political candidates or political parties, but it does take stands on issues that arise in the political arena. We support and oppose laws that will help or hurt our communities. Voter rights and voting has always been a cornerstone of the League of Women Voters.
Thank you. And Mr. Love, you're muted.
May I warn you that I say some of my most profound things, even my profound introduction, while I'm muted. I do unmute myself, bring myself down to earth. It's a pleasure to be on the panel with Mr. Alexander, Ms. Glissman, who I respect and know. And my name, of course, is Preston Love Jr., and I am the founder, the executive director of Black Votes Matter. I come to the table on this subject having a limited but a full 40 plus years in this arena. That's why I'm here today, because the work never stops. I'm hoping that this panel will bring it all to a close and we will just all go home and go to Disneyland. But this issue of voting rights is one that I have been a student of, a participant of, and a scholar of. And now in my own hometown, in my beloved North Omaha, I find myself working day in and day out as it relates to voter rights. And so it's a pleasure.
Well, that's a pretty tall order that we're going to solve all of the issues in this hour-long panel and then go to Disney World. But I hope that we'll go some distance anyway. So before talking about some of the efforts that are going on currently, I wonder if we could, Mr. Love, you just talked about having a long history of involvement in voting rights work. I wonder if we could talk a little bit about the ways in which you were involved, the three of you were involved in voting rights work before the 2000 election. When President Biden won the elector for the Omaha Congressional District in 2020, Precious McKesson, who was Biden's campaign political director in Nebraska, remarked that communities of color were crucial to our success in CD2. Black and Latino voters showed up, but also Native Americans, Asian Americans, Pacific Islanders, everybody, all communities of color showed up. We have a vote and our vote matters. So to the extent that there was a surge in voting of communities of color in 2020, what do you think led to that surge, and what work were you and your organizations doing that might have helped to lead to that surge? And Ms. Glissman, if you want to start with that question.
Sure, yeah, that was a definitely exciting, busy time. Just to summarize some of the great things that happened in November of 2020, that election. In Douglas County, there was a record turnout. It was almost 75%. And the youth, Nebraska youth, those ages 18 to 29, also had a record turnout of almost 50%, which was up from 41% in 2016. And it's interesting to note that 40% of first-time voters that year in 2020 were under 30. So that's just fantastic news because, it's shown that voting is a habit, and that once you form that habit, it's likely to persist throughout your life. So just a few more statistics, because that's what we do at the League. 63% of Douglas County voters that year voted by mail. And if you requested, those requesting ballots, mail-in ballots, 97% of those people requesting return those ballots. So that's outstanding. But as to factors that led to the increase in participation, let's think back to that traumatic time. We saw a spring and summer of civil unrest. We were living in the divisiveness of Trump. We had two very different presidential candidates. I think people wanted to make their voice heard. They believe their country's in crisis. And one of the very, very big factors was the expanded vote by mail that was seen. That process was expanded throughout the country. I just can't say enough about how hard everyone in Omaha worked, in Douglas County, and throughout the state, in all communities worked in 2020 to increase voter participation. So many partnerships were formed. So many organizations worked together to get out the vote. The League always focuses its effort on reaching underserved populations. We use VAN data, Voter Activation Network data, to tailor our canvassing and text banking and phone banking events to certain populations who are low percentage voters. Leading up to the 2020 election, however, we had to completely rethink how we were going to register voters. During the pandemic, we had to figure out how we were going to educate people without actually coming face to face with them. We were able to develop voter registration kits rather than having in-person events and rallies. These kits went to homeless shelters, jails, halfway houses, schools, assisted living centers, and often overlooked facilities. And luckily, like I said, the motivation on both sides was just outstanding. And so we were able to register a lot of people who would not normally have voted in 2020. We canvassed North and South Omaha and had educational Zoom events explaining how vote by mail worked. We explained what to do. Remember at that time, everyone in Douglas County, I think the state even got a postcard saying, hey, you have an option to vote by mail. So we talked about what to do when you receive that card. We even worked with the election commissioner, Brian Cruz, and he made a video saying that the process was safe. Remember how much misinformation was going on at that time. The League phone banked and text banked, often with Preston and Black Votes Matter to explain to people like when and how do you return your ballots that now that you've gotten them. The league always does a voter's guide, and the voter's guide last in 2020 during the pandemic was completely online rather than paper copies. But we still got it out. The voter's guide is a nonpartisan guide. It asks every person running for office the same set of questions and prints their answers. So we want an informed electorate. We want people to know who they have access and know who they're going to vote for. We also had our vote411.org website. People, no matter what precinct they're in, they can go online and look up to see what's going to be specifically on their ballot and do get some knowledge about who they want to vote for and see. So it's not just a surprise when they go into the polling place if that's the way they choose to vote. Let's see. Oh yeah, finally then we were able to work in high schools before the election or the pandemic shut down. And especially in North and South Omaha, we work with seniors in government and civics classes and talk about, hey, not this is how government works, but this is how you can shape your community to see what and make democracy work as you would like it to work. So that's I'll stop there, but it was a challenging time, but it was a great time because there were so many partnerships and people working together.
Thank you. Mr. Love, do you want to talk a little bit about the work that you were doing before 2020 in terms of, and what you saw in terms of increase in voter turnout for communities of color in particular?
Well, I think the answer is yes. First, let me say, I want to acknowledge and affirm Ms. Glissman's point about the value and now the impact of these collaborations that have developed over time we're getting things done together as opposed to in our own organization. I think I would be bold enough to say that that's changing to the better, more collaborations and more efficiency as we attack. Now, 2020, I guess that I want to say a couple things to preamble my thoughts about our work, my work, Black Votes Matter, and put 2020 in the context of time. And that is both in terms of the vote in Douglas County, and in particular, the vote of the Black and Brown, but also in the context of the national urban Black and Brown vote. All of that has to be pulled apart long enough for us to analyze the parts before we overgeneralize the whole. For example, in 2004 in Douglas County, the Black vote during a presidential year was 44%. 44. In 2008, it spiked because of Obama to 63 or so percent. That sounds pretty good, doesn't it? Well, yes and no. Yes, it's better than 44, but guess what? There was a 10% gap between the Black vote of 63% and the Douglas County vote of 72. Do you get my drift? There is a gap, even when the Black vote has been strong. Just quickly, 63% in 08, 57, a drop off in 12, a drop to 47 or 48% in 16, and then a rise because of some very interesting complexities to 60% in 2020. So when we say the vote was great in 2020, we must be more specific. It was good for the Black and brown, but not great. And the gap still remained. And by the way, I think that I should say that it is my contention that the Black vote for sure rises and falls, Mr. Alexander, on the emotion of the Black community, not the issues, not the complexities, but on the emotion. Notwithstanding that without, well, the emotion is my point, but it surely would be a lot lower had we not done the other things that Ms. Glissman was talking about, knocking on doors, making phone calls, advocating for a vote by mail. But if you strip that work, then you would be left with the emotion only, and the rise and fall is very significant based on either the negative or the positive emotion of Black folk. So back to 2020, what was interesting about 2020, uniquely interesting, is we had both emotions working at the very same time. We had the strong positive emotion in our community that we wanted to affirm a change in the administration. And we had the very strong negative emotion against the present administration. And so both of those got people out in a funny sort of way. And it really requires an analysis. So the Black Votes Matter, we collaborated with many others on the things that Ms. Glissman and many others could talk about, but we also tried to toggle and activate both of those emotions because we understand it. It's not something you can play with or something that you can just turn up the temperature. Emotion is raw and based on the truth of the matter in the community. And so I guess I would summarize by saying the analysis of 2020 is not that easy. And it surely was wrought in the Black community and brown community with that gap, as well as the bigger turnout issues that it appeared to be across the county.
Thank you. Mr. Alexander, would you like to add anything in terms of the work that you were doing in advance of 2020 and what you see in terms of the complexity of whether there was a surge and what that surge meant in terms of voting for communities of color?
Yeah, I do definitely recognize the surge, and I think that it was kind of what Ms. Glissman was speaking on, and Mr. Love was speaking on as well, just like the desire for change within our communities. The unfortunate thing is kind of what we feel like at the Revolutionary Action Party is when this surge came out, it was because Trump was overtly spewing this racist rhetoric and all of these things. But we were focusing so much on Trump, the individual, rather than the systems and the structures that were in place that was allowing Trump to do these things. And so that desire for change still remains prevalent in the minds of the communities, but our expectations always become transient with the lack of action that never happens. And we also recognize that the Democratic Party on a national level, the success and the progression of the Democratic Party is contingent on Black and brown votes. But we always see that our interests are disposable, especially when they become in the office, and especially when they hold a majority in the Senate. And a prime example is Joe Biden going to Black churches saying that he's for Black folk, and then in his plan, $1 trillion plan, he cuts $30 billion out of HBCU federal funds. And so it's stuff like that where our interests are always disposable. So at RAP, what we were doing was getting people registered to vote, but not on the premise of getting Biden into office, but getting people politically aware, getting people politically active. We can't implement any type of change if you don't even know who your city council member is, if you don't even know the bare intricacies that make up our municipal government, while also our national government as well. So when we're registering people to vote, it is under the assumption that Trump or Biden, in my opinion, he says way nicer things. He says Black Lives Matter, and he says he's for the LGBTQ community, while he's also signing off on bombs being or drones being bombed in the Middle East, and he still is the same imperialist. So I feel like for RAP, our drive is to eradicate the obstacles and the hurdles that we have to go through to implement significant change within our political sphere.
I think that makes a very good transition to the next question in terms of talking
May I
about.
ask, before you do,
Yeah,
for just maybe a minute to affirm some of the things that Mr. Alexander said as it relates to what I said. We said the same thing. It doesn't sound like it, but we did. And I want to just quickly say that if you broke down the effort that we all work on, it could be broken down into very 2 or 3 parts. One is, and one that I want to emphasize on his part, was voter education. There's voter registration, there's mobilization, there's get out the vote, but voter education is really a big part of what he said. And it's a big part of what I said, even though I never used that term, because what we're finding is the rank and file voters, first of all, are not sitting up like I do, watching CNN and all the other news outlets all night long, writing down notes. They're not. And in poverty-stricken communities, they're worried about how they're going to feed their kids and whether or not their kids are going to live because they didn't get, that's what the community. And so we're expecting our community to translate all of these things without repeating Mr. Alexander's point about what is being said and what is being done. All of that is why the vote is retarded. It's because people are not sorting through these things. We do our best we can, and they're not sorting. And so in effect, they're not voting, even though we work them so hard, we get them out maybe because they believe in us, they believe in your organization, they believe in my, or they believe in other credible sources, the league, but we're missing the real point, and that we're celebrating numbers that are not that high. They were high in 2020, but it is complex what those numbers, what's beneath those numbers as it relates to what people feel and the confidence they have. Now we have, and I don't want to take any more time with, but surely we need to talk about the lack of confidence in democracy in itself based on the events that are evolving. And then that makes our work that much more difficult and getting the vote out. I'm sorry.
no, that's, thank you very much. That's very helpful. When we're talking about, you said we're celebrating a vote that's not that high, a voter turnout that's not that high. Which leads into this question relating to redistricting. And so we just finished a process of redistricting in Nebraska in the unicameral. We redistricted for congressional districts as well as for the state legislative districts. And I wondered if, particularly in terms of talking about, you know, what we just talked about in terms of voter education, voter turnout, and listening to voters, what you think the effects of this recent redistricting might be, and what effect might it have on the representation of communities of color. And Mr. Love, would you mind starting with that question?
I'd love to. I first want to say this, that in effect, what happened in 2020 during the process is those of us who are advocates for independent redistricting, for fair redistricting, and for redistricting under one name, but really gerrymandering on the real, is what we were focused on. We spent so much time playing defense as a community as opposed to offense. We were faced with two basic proposals, one of which was horrible. It was proposing to divide the Black and brown communities and divide a cohesive county. It was a bad, but had enough people went to sleep, we would be talking about this horrible result. So we played defense and we did a pretty good job. But playing defense and doing a good job does not mean you had a great plan at the end. You had a great plan in the context of what it could have been. And so we were able to salvage a very gross gerrymandering. And we were able to at least have something that makes sense that we can so-called live with. And so I want to say how much time. I thought it would be interesting. I may not want to take the time right now until others speak. I listed the time that we spent doing unique talkable items just on redistricting and also on the voter ID, just to, as in Alice in Wonderland, stand in place, let alone making progress, fighting for voting rights and democracy, because what's embedded these days and in Nebraska is we really are fighting the battle for democracy and voter suppression. So the answer to your question is, I think we did okay considering, but we did not do great. There is talk, as I close, about this process being so difficult that maybe they might have to do something really strange, which is have an independent process. Ha ha, wouldn't that be great? Hello.
Thank you, Mr. Alexander.
Yeah, I totally agree with what Mr. Love had said. I think that the attempt to completely cleaver any political power or any political representation that the Black and brown communities do have, when we should be coalescing under a common agenda, we're getting fragmented just off of the swipe of a pen or the drawing of a pen with our elected officials deciding this. And I feel like it's really emblematic of the contradictions within our political sphere. And like to Mr. Love's point on democracy and the fallacy behind democracy, on how our representation or how our voice can completely overnight, I mean, it almost was overnight completely just be stripped away from us. And I think it speaks volumes to and honestly, the corruption that's within our political sphere on a legal basis. It's corrupt to its core, but they are still bound by the law or allowed to do this by law. So for us at the Revolutionary Action Party, it just heightens the contradictions within our communities as well, which thrusts us into more political activity, and it thrusts us into recognizing that we aren't jiving with this, and we need to make a change. And how are we going to implement those changes, and how are we going to make our voices heard? So I do think, and to Mr. Love's point, Omaha was saved in regards to the inimical circumstances that would have came about. But Lincoln, Black and brown folk in Lincoln are still having to face this, and same across the country. So even though that in Omaha we were able to be saved by this gerrymandering type tactic, That's not the case for the general aspect across this country. And once again, it just thrusts us into more activity.
Ms. Glissman?
Yeah, thank you. The league was very involved in this process. Starting last spring, we did a lot of educational seminars across the state, trying to let people know this was coming and trying to make them aware of how the process worked, because we knew it would be such a time crunch. We were intimately involved in the committees. I mean, watching the redistricting committee, and I have a couple points here that I think were outcomes that were not good. The Nebraska 2nd District now has part of the largest metro area in the state, and it's paired with a county made up entirely of farmland and small towns. Another not so good, the Omaha hearing, open hearing. Preston was there, he testified, the league testified. That committee and leadership absolutely ignored the public comments and if not disparaged the public comments. And that was really the only time that there were people of color even testifying at a hearing. So that was just deplorable. The Grand Island hearing was not much better. There were, that District 36, there were good reasons not to split that, and it was split anyway. Like Bear said, Lancaster County is absolutely gerrymandered now. Those communities of color in Lancaster County, someone now who's in the midst of Lincoln is also represented by the same person who represents someone down on the Kansas border. So there were definitely problems, definitely bad outcomes. Some of the good things I will point out, some of the problems with the previous maps. Grand Island has been redrawn, and the large Latino population is put back together now in this new map. The tribal lands in northeastern Omaha or northeastern Nebraska have not been split up. I guess the bottom line is that we really found out which legislators are receptive to their constituents and to Nebraskans, and which really do not care to listen at all. I wish, unfortunately, I think a lot of Nebraskans do not understand this process, do not want to maybe understand. That's very sad to me. With all the education, the league at least tried to do. The takeaway is vote for the people that will want to hear your input. And the other huge takeaway is that this should be done by an independent commission. We should not have legislators do this process. This is a math problem that should be done independently. So.
May I make a quick comment?
Mm-hmm.
And put some numbers to Ms. Glissman's point about the Omaha hearing. First of all, it was a standing room only, or over 200 people in the room, in which only a percentage, about a third of them, wanted to testify. And I believe the numbers are between 80 and 85 testified. And of the 80 to 85 that testified, it was more than 5 to 1, 5 or 6 to 1 in one direction. And the committee, after 4 or 5 hours of the testimonies in that direction, took 10 minutes and voted just the opposite. That was an insult. I took it personal because I had to sit. Go ahead.
Yeah, sorry, I was keeping track, Preston, and I think it was well over 95, 92%.
I was trying to be nice in front of company. Yeah. But, and so my point is that, number one. And number two, very quickly, the problem that we saw so clearly for those who are really watching and listening. And so therefore it's important for us to say it on a panel like this. It's everything that is politically said by, in this case, the Ricketts administration, and then the Republican Party has to be brought into focus because the process has become too political. It's okay for the governor to say whatever he wants and have views on this and members of the Senate, but all it's filtering into these processes. It's all over it for what reason or another. And so it must be, and what we need to be focusing on, I guess, for the next several years, we only have this opportunity once every 10 years. I've only got about 3 or 4 of these left. But but we really saw how the politics has creeped into some of these measures, like redistricting too much.
Well, speaking of politics related to voter suppression, we have gone from the debate regarding redistricting, and at the same time, we were involved in the debate regarding voter ID, and that continues now. There's a petition currently circulating to put on the Nebraska Constitution an amendment that would require voter ID to vote. I wondered if you could talk a little bit about what your thoughts are about voter ID in general, and what would be the likely effect of that constitutional amendment were it to pass. And Mr. Alexander, do you want to go ahead and start with that question?
This one, I actually didn't know this before I watched All in Fight for Democracy, about how 20 million, this would or could potentially affect 20 million voters, about 10% of the voting pool. And so it is logical to assume that this would work in favor of the right and the Republican Party, and it's just another tool that they would use to try and maintain and sustain the power that they have right now, which is still which is growing, in my opinion. The right is growing, and they're all unified on thought. But yeah, I think that the voter IDs. The statistics, I'm not too privy on the statistics in Nebraska, but I just look at that as another tool for voter suppression and to muzzle Black and brown community members and poor community members as well, the ones that are most disenfranchised by our system and by the decisions that are made within our political sphere. The ones that are affected the most are the ones that have the tightest muzzle. So I think that, yeah, I think it's oppressive and suppressive, to say the least.
Ms. Glisman?
Yes, definitely suppressive. The Lincoln Journal-Star editorial board wrote an article this summer, says, and the title was "Voter ID Aims to Address a Problem That Does Not Exist." That's absolutely how the league feels. Elections in Nebraska are already safe, efficient, secure. We register voters weekly. To do so, we become deputy registrars. We take classes that the Election Commission itself puts on. The Election Commission, we go through the process with them. They absolutely check everything, signatures, addresses, everything. When a voter registers to vote, after, they sign their ballots. I mean, the process is safe and secure. Also, voting is a fundamental right in the Nebraska Constitution. The Constitution says, I wrote this down, okay? All elections shall be free, and there shall be no hindrance or impediment to the right of qualified Nebraskans to vote. So absolutely, this amendment creates a hindrance and an impediment for people to vote. especially rural, low income, young, Black, Brown, senior, LGBTQ plus Nebraskans. It would cost millions to implement, hundreds of thousands of dollars to maintain. It burdens voters with repetitive extra requirements. In a healthy democracy, voters must be able to make their voice heard. This results in Nebraskans being less free. So absolutely, voter restriction is not necessary, not needed. It's a hindrance. We fully support, we fully are encouraging everyone to decline to sign the voter ID amendment.
And Mr. Love, do you want to talk a little bit about the decline to sign movement in your answer, just so that people are aware of how that's working and how you're involved in that?
Yes, let me start there by saying that voter ID, well, I want to discuss, but I'm going to put it towards the end of my discussion about the historical nature of pushback voter restriction. That'll take a second or two, but right away, let me just say that for 6 years or maybe 7, the League and so many other organizations, including mine and myself, have gone to Lincoln and fought the battle to fight back the attempt to have voter ID in Nebraska. It's important for people to know that the primary reason that that voter ID was introduced and is introduced and continues to be introduced is for fraud. Fraud has been studied and not studied, but there is no voter fraud in Nebraska that would require us to tamper with it. It used to be a phrase, maybe it has gone down the river. If it's not broke, don't fix it. This is not broke, and let's fix it. But I'll tell you, having watched Nebraska volleyball a lot, and I enjoy it, I watched them do something that is happening to us. One of the players jumps up like she's getting ready to hit the ball, and another one hits the ball and scores, because that player who first jumped up became the focus, and the whole team focused on the wrong player, and they got scored. And what the voter fraud is about is playing volleyball with our intelligence. And that is, voter fraud is not the issue. Voter restriction is the issue. And it has been the issue since the 15th Amendment, 1870. And then the reaction of Jim Crow to the Black folks voting like crazy after the 15th Amendment, which was in 1870. And then the Black folks elected Black folks to Congress and governorships and state house all over this country. And Jim Crow stepped up and said, we got to stop this. And there became a list of impediments, and voter ID or something like that was part of that. It has been a strategy since the early 1900s, for those of us who know the history. And so let us not play that this is about voter fraud. This is about voter restriction. And then after the 1965 Voting Rights Act, which put a lot of these things to bed for a while, it was then attacked in the Supreme Court in 2013 with Shelby versus Holder. And it took all the teeth out of that law. And guess what began to pop up everywhere? Voter ID. And so here we are. And so there was even some quotes that from some other states that said, oh, we finally got voter ID. Now we can go ahead and really win some elections. Yeah, they told the truth. And so here we are in Nebraska. And so after all of those years, the new strategy is to go and try to get voter ID on the ballot. And to get it on the ballot, their petition, and Ms. Glissman may know the exact number of signatures required, but that if you do, you can just interrupt and say, tell folks. But a large number of signatures, if they are able to get those signatures, then voter ID will be put on the ballot to amend the Nebraska Constitution to make voter ID required. And so the first thing to stop the nonsense is to decline to sign the petition. That's why we say decline to sign. Stop the madness before it becomes madness. Stop, decline, don't sign. And so that's what's up. And I would also add that there is a implicit strategy that if you put this before the state, there are so many people who have no knowledge of the struggle, no knowledge of what's really going on, who would just knee-jerk vote, oh yeah, voter ID, no big deal. And so that's what they're relying on for that to go out among the state with people who are worrying about raising their crops and not worrying about what voter ID really means. So we need to stop the nonsense now by declining to sign.
We are running up against a time constraint. We have about 10 more minutes. And I'm thinking that I would combine a couple of questions and ask you what you think people should be focused on. People who are concerned about the state of American democracy, who are concerned about the voter suppression efforts that we're seeing across the nation, particularly the ones that we're seeing here in Nebraska with voter ID. What are your organizations doing that they could be involved in? What do you think people should do who want to be active on these issues and to make a difference? Where should we concentrate our efforts, and where do you plan on concentrating yours? So I'll leave it to you to decide who wants to go first with that question.
Well, if you want, I will jump in and just talk about something we haven't talked about yet, and I'll be brief, but the League fully supports the Freedom to Vote Act. And we encourage everyone to call their senators early and often and every day and tell them to vote for the Freedom to Vote Act, and also the John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act. The John Lewis Voting Rights Advancement Act undoes some of it restores the Voting Rights Act of 1965. And then the Freedom to Vote Act is the Compromise Act that used to be, well, it's a compromise proposed by Senator Klobuchar and Manchin, and it replaces the For the People Act. And that, again, will require every state to have automatic voter registration. It makes Election Day a holiday. It automatically allows citizens to request a mail ballot. An insidious form of voter suppression is when states don't allow returning citizens to vote, and this automatically requires states to allow people released from prison to vote. It addresses dark money, it bans partisan gerrymandering, allows same-day voter registration, and just all kinds of requirements like that. So we think this is a huge step forward, helps eliminate some of these terrible laws. 18 states, I think, have enacted 30 laws to suppress the vote just this year. So yeah, that's a quick thing that I would like to mention and encourage everyone to talk about this and get their senators to vote for these acts.
Great.
I surely would quickly say that I would urge people to be sensitized to these matters and that almost understand that we're talking, again, somewhat redundant in the panel, but about democracy and not just voter ID and these restrictions and redistricting, but an assault on democracy. That should get people's attention. So I am advocating for people to become more sensitized to what's at stake. Number one, that they take every opportunity to educate themselves or to be advocates to their family and their friends and their circles and their church, to be advocates for people to have more knowledge and urge people to be more sensitive. And then lastly, to volunteer with organizations that you know and trust and are credible, and do the things that they're asking you to do, such as calling and writing the elected officials. I want to 30 seconds, I think it won't take me any longer, to make a short report. I write a regular editorial in the Omaha World Herald and have touched on these issues of voter restriction. I've had recently a town hall, standing room only, on redistricting in our community. We testified at the hearings for redistricting. We had a march recently on voter ID and redistricting. We did a motorcade, and I'd say we were collaborating with a lot of others. We spoke to the media. I have written 5 books on the subject, and I teach at UNO. That's what I'm doing. And so I say, what are you doing? And what should you be doing is realizing that democracy is being assaulted. Don't sit by and watch it.
Yeah, we at the Revolutionary Party, we recognize all the problems that I mean, even for voter suppression, but honestly, all the problems that we're facing right now that is directly correlated with our political sphere is working exactly how our politics was made to work. And I think they even discussed that in the documentary, how the genesis of our political atmosphere, 6% of people were allowed to vote, and that was rich white men. And now in 2021, we're still facing the same problems on exclusion, especially with Black and brown votes. So we also look at our ancestors, and we look at our ancestors for guidance and motivation, and we see the work that the Student Nonviolent Coordinating Committee did in Mississippi and also in Alabama as well, where they recognized that the 2 political parties that were supposed to represent us were not representing us by any means, by any way, shape, or form, and that in order to create real political power, we need to coalesce and unify on a unified basis, not on a monolithic standpoint by any means, because our culture is too diverse, but we do need to come on a unified thought on what we want, how we're going to get there, and what we're going to implement when we do get there as well. So what we are working on, I mean, honestly, even to the example of Brown versus Board of Education, when that was made within our political sphere, it was cut out and completely cleavered in the 80s. And same with the Voting Rights Act. Now we're fighting to get John Lewis Voting Rights Act, pretty much the same exact thing, but 50 years later. So working within this, I'm not relegating working within that system, but the system that we have that's put in place is just trap doors, and it's up to us to find out how do we completely eradicate that. And too many times we see people encouraging people, okay, recognize those obstacles that our political sphere puts in place, and then learn how to maneuver around them and learn how to jump higher, rather than completely tearing down the obstacles and tearing down the hurdles and eradicating them from our lives. So I feel like with what Mr. Love and Ms. Glissman said, I think it's imperative of like the duality of action, where we do need people working within this, fighting to implement these changes, but then we also need mass organization as well. And when I say mass organization, I don't want it to be misconstrued as mass mobilization, where we saw with the George Floyd protests, where millions of people came out and their energy completely spontaneously, but their energy dissipated because there was no organization put in place to actually implement change and demand change. And Frederick Douglass always said, change will not come, or power comes only from demand, or power does not, it's like power does not come without demands. So yeah, what we're doing right now is getting people politically aware, politically active, but then also recognizing that voter suppression is a tool used by our colonial system and by our political entities. And in order to completely alleviate our stress from those levels, we need to focus on, our place is to focus on that system and trying to take down that system.
Well, I want to thank the three of you for what has been an amazing conversation. I think you all brought unique perspectives, different experiences to this very important question. And I, for one, found it to be a fascinating discussion and some really good suggestions about how we can be involved and how we have to be involved. This is such an important time in our history, and we can't sit this one out. So I want to thank you for the panel. I have been recording this, and I will make it available to each of the panelists, and please feel free to share it. I would love for it to have a larger audience. If people have questions, can they contact you directly? Okay. All right. Thank you very much.
I've put my name and website, email, that is, on the chat.
Perfect. Thank you.
Yes, please feel free to follow up with anything.
Perfect. Thank you very much.
Thank you.